Hello and welcome to the Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series and to this virtual edition of our seminar series that enables us to welcome Katherine Bassil. Dr. Katherine Bassil is assistant professor at the Julius Center, University Medical Center Utrecht in the Netherlands, where she conducts research in neuroethics. She's also a Niels Stensen Fellow at the Technical University of Munich, focusing on the ethical implications of large language models in brain and mental health care. Her research focuses on the ethical and social implications of neuroscience research and neurotechnologies, and explores the implications of neuroscientific models, invasive neurotechnologies, digital mental health tools, public participation in research, science and ethics communication, and digital phenotyping. Beyond her research, Dr. Bassil is deeply engaged in science policy and public outreach. She's an active member of the International Neuroethics Society, where I met her, an editorial assistant at Neuroethics Canada, and ethics lead for the IEEE Neuroethics Framework Wellness Group. She contributes to the global neuroethics initiatives as a member of the International Brain Initiative Cross-Cultural Working Group and as research ethics track lead at the Atlas Bioethics Center. Dr. Bassil was awarded the 2022-23 Harvard Neuroethics Fellowship, where she contributed to discussions on the ethics of predictive biomarkers for post-traumatic stress disorder, and is also the founder of Neuroethics Today, an educational platform dedicated to raising awareness on neuroethics worldwide and democratizing neuroethics literacy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katherine Bassil.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I am very happy to be here today and to present some of my work. And I also like to call this my passion work because I will be also covering some of what Deborah introduced regarding neuroethics today. Maybe just very briefly, I will say that I am trained as a neuroscientist, but I turned, so with time, I became a neuroethicist and what I like to call a science or ethics communicator, which I will also share a bit more about that throughout my presentation. So today I'm going to be talking about responsible communication of brain research, neurotechnology, and neuroethics, raising some or highlighting some challenges and then trying to suggest certain solutions. So we live in an era of misinformation, and science isn't immune to that. We live also in an era of technological uprising, and ethics in some instances is still considered an afterthought. Now, misinformation isn't really just a political issue. It really affects science. And neurotechnology isn't only there as a medical intervention, it is really here to revolutionize life as we know it. And so here are some screenshots of news titles covering emerging neurotechnologies, covering neuroscientific breakthroughs and models like the one on mini brains. But also I showed on the right side of the slides more in relation to how politics also very much intersects with science and information or science communication regarding scientific public health issues, but also scientific practices. And if we think a little bit about genetics in relation to neuroscience, they are very much similar. So back when the Genome Project was announced around the 1990s and 2000s, there was really a lot of ethical questions that were raised. As a result, there were task forces that were created and put to tackle these ethical and societal issues. There were even genetic counselors that really became a thing to help individuals that have undergone genetic testing to start navigating this information, make sense of the findings, and see how this will have implications on their daily lives. And similarly, neuroscience, and we're increasingly seeing how neuroscience and neurotechnology carries really a unique status among the sciences, because it is not just simply describing the world around us, but it also really reveals something that is very fundamental about who we are as humans. And together with emerging innovation in neurotechnology, they are increasingly really shaping our world, but also the way they are communicated, either can inform the public or they can also mislead the public. And so, similar to politics, social issues, science, and especially neuroscience here, is often misrepresented. It can lead to fear, hype, as we also typically refer to as neurohype, but also even misunderstandings and misinformation. But what really makes communicating neuroscience and neurotechnology challenging, and as a result, really raising ethical issues and ethical concerns? I will describe here a few challenges that I think relate to the poor communication, or the challenges that are associated with the communication of neuroscience and neuroethics. First of all is language barrier, which I will cover in a minute. But language barriers between different stakeholders and actors could be one example. Political influences, which we are increasingly seeing nowadays. Clickbait tactics within certain media or platforms. Bad journalism. Lack of incentives, low resources to really employ the correct the correct ways, but also the workforce and the number of people and experts to really communicate responsibly and correctly the information. Neuroscience and neurotechnology is really an emerging field with very little governance. Every time a new finding comes out, we also are struggling to make sense of it, to see how it will have implications and societal implications. And finally, I could say we are trying to understand the human brain, which is in and of itself really an unsolvable puzzle with very loose ends. So those are some of the challenges that really relate to communicating neuroscience and neuroethics. But I want to focus particularly on the language barriers in science communication. So language barriers in this context can come in different layers or in different dimensions, and I will mention three of them. One dimension is really attributed to the differences in native languages, which influences how communities and populations express their values, their beliefs, and their ideas. For instance, most Eastern countries and countries from the global South receive a lot of scientific information that is translated and from English, and a lot can really be lost in translation. And second, there are also discipline-specific and vocabulary that sometimes even hinder crosstalk between different fields and between different experts. A third dimension is the level of accessibility of the language that is used in publications and articles and videos and reports, and really other mediums to communicate science. And this also can influence the ability to understand the content and the depth of neuroscientific findings or news relating to neurotechnology. Now, these together can really create barriers that kind of impede the process of conveying neuroscience and neurotechnology or neurotechnological findings that is in a responsible and accurate way to diverse publics. But what really happens? So what is really here the problem with not really attending to these language barriers? And what are the consequences if we are failing at communicating neuroscientific findings and news about neurotechnological innovations to the public? So there are a number of things may result. I will mention some of them. Misinformation and neuroalarmism. So really when certain findings are overhyped, or we also have false claims that are made. So one example that I will also go into later on through in the presentation, which is when we see a coverage on brain or neural organoids titled as "Scientists are creating conscious mini brains in a dish." It also sometimes and this relates a lot to the use of clickbait tactics and sensationalism in the media in order to create a certain hype about scientific breakthroughs and developments in science and technology. We also related to that, and then as a result of that, we are seeing increasing public misunderstanding about a lot of the research that is happening behind closed doors, but also this is associated with increased fear and public distrust in science. And this is not very particular or unique to neuroscience, but we also see that especially because there is a lot of hype that is associated with neuroscience research and these very cutting edge neurotechnologies that are being developed. And this eventually also leads to poor policy and ethical decision making. And this all kind of creates a vicious loop where we have this kind of like never ending cycle of poor communication, and as a result, poor policy and a bad impact on public health, but also on literacy in relation to science literacy, health literacy, and in particular in this case, neuroliteracy. And so what I want to propose today is we need a structured way to communicate neuroscience. We need a structured way to also communicate the ethics of neuroscience and neurotechnology. And this is where I introduce the concept of neuroethics communication. So what is neuroethics communication? Per definition, the way I see it, neuroethics communication is the responsible communication of both neuroscience and neurotechnology advancements and the ethical issues surrounding them in a way that is accurate, accessible, and meaningful to diverse audiences. Now, there are two pillars that I will be covering and making use of certain cases to kind of support these two pillars as fundamental pillars of neuroethics communication. The first one relates to responsible and ethical science communication, which is about how we are talking about neuroscience research and innovation. So the way we are doing that. And the second pillar really relates more to making neuroethical issues accessible. So how are we communicating and how are we raising awareness to the public about ethical dilemmas in neuroscience and neurotechnology that are also complex, just like the science itself? How are we explaining them? How are we making this information accessible to the wider public? And I will start with the first pillar, which is the responsible and ethical communication in neuroscience and neurotechnology. So I initially discussed the consequences of poor communication. And as I said in the beginning, these consequences are not unique to neuroscience and neurotechnology. However, where does it become peculiar to neuroscience and neurotechnology? What is really the impact there when we are starting to poorly communicate and see misinformation in the context of neuroscience and neurotechnology? And I will give three examples of what this could look like and why brain science and innovation requires, specifically these fields require responsible communication. First, I will start how this has implications for human identity and agency. The brain is really, as I was saying, linked to who we are, to our thoughts, to our emotions and decisions. And in turn, miscommunication about these aspects, because neuroscience tries to better understand all these different aspects, can spark certain behavioral changes, nudges towards certain behavioral changes. But also, for example, this could lead to people, for example, consuming more brain headsets because they have read that they have an immense potential in helping them alleviate stress and in alleviating certain cognitive issues, or even in enhancing certain cognitive issues. But also this could lead to existential questions and existential fears, such as, and raising questions such as, will brain implants that are currently being investigated for really neurological and debilitating conditions, could these eventually control our minds? Can they probably also take over our brains? So this is one implication. The second relates more to the direct impact on policy and the ethical impact or the ethical dimension there. So we know that public perception shapes policy decisions. And this can also, for example, bring certain funding restrictions on certain and particular kinds of scientific practices and particular research practices. So if we look at the recent neuro rights movement, for instance, and the implementation of neuro rights laws, and this has really taken a lot of it really has been also hyped in a way in Latin America, where they have been at the forefront of implementing already neuro rights and laws to protect individuals from infringements on their neuro rights. There has been a lot of experts, and this is probably something that we don't typically see a lot in the news and in the media, that have actually criticized this movement as being too premature, because there is we don't want to implement prematurely certain laws that might also, for example, hinder progress in the fields of neurotechnology and neuroscience. But we can also think of other examples that are not necessarily neurotechnology related, but are in Latin America, and not in Latin America, but in the US, for example, the use of neuroscience, or to say it better, the misuse of neuroscience, has also played a role in the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And even if we look a few decades back, the banning of the use of human embryonic stem cells for research purposes has also taken a hit due to the use of also, or the misuse of, certain scientific information in order to implement such policy. And third, also, neuroscience is a very interdisciplinary field that carries in itself a lot of hurdles and challenges. So neuroscience in particular really works at the crossroads with different disciplines, including biology, psychology, now more recently AI, but also ethics. And this creates a lot of challenge because, as I said in the very beginning, this language barrier also exists between different disciplines, and it makes it difficult sometimes to translate certain concepts from one discipline to the other. So one example could be that there has been recently neuroscientists that were able to reactivate a certain cellular activity in the brain of pigs that have been deceased. And so what the news read, or what we saw on the news, is that scientists were able to revive pig brains and brought them back to life, which is completely not illustrative of what actually happened, because, as I was saying, in fact, the activity was really observed at a cellular level and not necessarily at a functional level, or not, the pig did not really regain consciousness, so to say. And in this whole process of science communication, there are really different actors that are involved. And later on, I will make use of certain examples and certain cases to showcase why we need neuroethics communications and how different actors also carry different responsibilities. And I will start with journalists and the media. So science communication, as I was saying, shapes public perception, policy, but also research funding. And as is showcased here in this figure, media outreach, when done well, can really have several benefits, including informing society, showcasing the scientific breakthroughs of the field and in the innovations that are associated with that, and also impact policy in a positive way, eventually even enhancing public trust in science. However, when done poorly, journalism or the media can also propagate misinformation, fear, neuroalarmism, and even lead to misguided policies, as I had explained in the examples of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the neuro rights movements, and also the use of stem cells in research. And so I will start by presenting the case of brain organoids, or to better say, neural organoids. And here I want to kind of raise the point that language really has a very crucial role in shaping public understanding of brain research. And so what are neural organoids? Neural organoids are a specific tissue that resembles in many ways the human brain, both at a cellular level, both in the way it is the cells are organized in this tissue, and also functionally, we are starting to see certain similarities with a developing human brain. It is far from an actual, fully grown and functional human brain. And it is considered a model that is used in neuroscientific research in order to study certain aspects of a developing brain, to test certain drugs, and has potential definitely in that area. Now, the problem here is the use of the misleading language in neural organoid research. So in a recent opinion article that I wrote, which I titled "The End of Mini Brains: Responsible Communication of Brain Organoid Research," I put forward the point that we need to step away from calling neural organoids mini brains, which is how journalists, media has referred to them in pieces where they are trying to translate or to communicate with the public breakthroughs and findings in that research. And so a good title, and here we can also start looking at what are good science communication practices, is also looking at how is the title accurately and correctly reflecting the science itself. So scientific description of brain organoid research and the way we define brain organoids is saying that brain organoids are 3D cell structures that are used to study neurological diseases. It is not using any technical or high technical jargon, and it is still pretty understandable that it is used to investigate and to study certain neurological diseases. A clickbait headline resembles more the other one, which is scientists are creating lab-grown brains that may be conscious. And there already we start seeing that there is absolutely nothing true or factual or that reflects what we are seeing in the lab and what scientists are actually doing with these neuroscientific models. And so as a result of using misleading language, this can result in a number of things, including hype and false hope. Creating false hope in that case, and especially in regards to the pig brains that were revived or that regained certain cellular activity, certain patients or certain caregivers might think that this is a big step towards helping individuals that have, for example, had severe strokes and as such has lost certain brain functions and brain capacities, and that by having this research, they are very close to helping their loved ones or to getting better, even though the science is very far from still being applied and practiced and in order to be able to help patient groups. It also propagates misinformation. Scientists are growing mini brains in the lab. Are they conscious? Of course, these are questions that we also can raise and that we can engage in this discussion. We need to. This is what neuroethics does. It engages in these questions. But when we share this kind of information, and especially in the titles, and we know, and there are studies that show that a lot of individuals gather their information just by scanning titles. And nowadays, with social media, with platforms like TikTok, our attention spans have decreased, and individuals and people don't want to read anymore long articles that are explaining the nitty-gritty details of a certain scientific breakthrough or of a certain neurotechnological innovation. It is enough for them to just watch a 30-second, 1-minute video that is kind of just explaining to them in a very catchy and interactive way what is the science about? And of course, we can argue that this has also its advantages and can also kind of increase interest in science, but it can also have its own pitfalls. Because on the one hand, of course, we are trying to make science accessible, but we are also spreading misinformation. Another study was published here. So this is a scientific publication that shared how in vitro neurons are learning and exhibiting sentience when embodied in a simulated game world. And again, here, the use of terms like learning and exhibiting sentience is problematic. And here, especially, we're not even talking about neural organoids. We are talking about 2D cells that were grown in a dish. And this spread of misinformation, this unscientific oversimplification can also or what I want to say here is that there's been a group of scientists, neuroscientists, that have also, as a way, responded to this last scientific publication that is claiming that these neurons are learning and that these neurons are exhibiting sentience, by saying we need a consensus about how we are referring to these nervous system organoids and assembloids, and that we should, as a community, including ethicists, scientists, and also journalists and science communicators, use a standardized way of referring to these brain organoids in order to avoid this unscientific oversimplification, but also to avoid misinformation and have an accurate depiction of what the field is practicing. Another consequence of using such language is something that we refer to as the yuck factor, which is when individuals start having a certain disgust in relation to certain scientific practices. In this case, we could think of how when neural organoids are transplanted in rodents, in the brain of rodents, there's also studies where the public was interviewed and individuals were interviewed about their perceptions about the use of neural organoids, and specifically about the creation of chimeras, which is where neural organoids are transplanted into the brains of rodents. And asking about their perceptions about that. And there's a lot of individuals that had this sense of disgust and kind of were not really supportive. And of course, there are several reasons why individuals might have this reaction, and not all of it relates to the use of misleading language. Sometimes it could be cultural, it could be due to religious reasons as well. And those are also things that should be taken into account when communicating research findings to a public that is diverse. And so in this paper, we argue, in particular during my PhD, I was focusing on investigating the stress or the effects of the stress hormone cortisol on 2D pluripotent stem cell derived neurons. And here we kind of also argued that the more we make use of misleading language, one could eventually make the conclusion, if not well communicated, that when we are investigating stress hormones in these neural organoids, and if we start describing these organoids as potentially having sentience or consciousness, a lot of individuals or a lot of groups might believe, or we might give them the belief, that we are stressing and harming these organoids in the lab. And we don't want to create this perception, especially that we do not have the evidence that says that these organoids have signs of consciousness. At least not yet. And I think we should be very cautious of making such claims and such conclusions. And finally, a lot of these points that I just mentioned also eventually lead to a public backlash and distrust. if people feel misled, or if they are not really supportive of certain practices, especially because of the way they are being communicated and portrayed, the trust in neuroscience will decline. And this does not only apply to neural organoids. We can also think about neurotechnology, and a certain fear about, for example, mind control might start to emerge. And but the public might start opposing this kind of research. And we have been seeing it in relation to vaccines, in relation to embryonic stem cells. So we want to avoid kind of creating this narrative and this incentive that eventually leads to misleading policy, and hindering neuroscientific advancements and neurotechnological innovations. And so in this case in particular, there are several stakeholders that have a role in ensuring that we are communicating responsible advances in neural organoid research in a way that improves public understanding. I will now move to another actor, which is scientists in particular, because we've also seen in cases of describing or discussing neurohacking. And this is also not necessarily only in the field of neuroscience, but also in the neuroethics literature, when there is in the neuroethics literature, when there's a lot of discussions about the implications of neurotechnologies, implantable or consumer neurotechnologies, the term neurohacking is widely used. And so Ienka and Scheibner, in this review, they analyzed the different themes that emerge in the use of the term neurohacking in the literature. And they identify 4 different themes: human enhancement, malicious hacking, casual understanding of human brain processes, and non-malicious hacking or self-experimentation. And what we see here is that in their analysis, it led them to conclude that these 4 different distinct activities that fall under neurohacking raise different ethical issues that are also governed by distinct regulatory mechanisms. And so the neurohacking spectrum encompasses activities with very different degrees of ethical permissibility and regulatory standards. And this, of course, does not only hold true to neurohacking. We can definitely also identify other terms like manipulation, which can also be used in different contexts differently. However, this influences the ethical discourse. And so the conclusion I want to make for the use and the importance in the use of language is that a semantic, in this case in particular, a semantic disambiguation, as they argue, is really necessary not only to advance neuroscience and neurotechnology, but also and foremost for the benefits of neuroethics and technology governance. And I want to move now to another actor, an important actor that has often been neglected in science communication efforts, and that's the public, communities. Normally, current science communication practices really follow a top-down approach. We employ predefined methodologies, and there are predefined actors that are involved in the process of science communication, which is typically and most often experts, journalists, and similar press officers. However, this approach follows a deficit model. And what I mean by that is that we are assuming that healthcare professionals and experts are really the holders of all knowledge. This is a very paternalistic approach, and we regard patients, communities, and other stakeholders that are not engaged or performing the science itself as those that require the scientific information and that everything needs to be explained to them. And of course, for certain instances, some of it is true, but it doesn't complete all the picture. We cannot make sense of the implications of a scientific finding or of a neurotechnological innovation without taking into account the end user, the communities, the patients, the caregivers. And if we look at definitions of science communication, there are more traditional definitions like this one, which says that science communication is a process that aims to interact with non-expert audiences regarding information on science and technology. But more inclusive definitions are like the one by Bryant, which says that science communication is a process where culture and knowledge of science are absorbed into the culture of the wider community. And so why do we need to take into consideration community in science communication or inclusivity in science communication? If we look at, for example, indigenous communities, often, and not only indigenous communities, but also marginalized groups, they are often framed in a negative way without placing their health stories into historical and cultural context. Indigenous communities are often labeled as having addiction problems. But these articles that cover the addiction challenges that indigenous people face, or a lot of the indigenous communities face, it is not put in the context of the trauma that they endured, the resilience that they had to build up. And this is very, it lacks, it portrays them in a negative way, and it doesn't also create incentives to further research or further help these communities. This deficit-based approach also tends to shift the blame onto these individuals and neglect any existing environmental factors that require the attention and action to address these health disparities. And so similar to research with participants or patient participation and engagement practices, science communication should and ought to be done with communities and not just to communities. And so here in particular, I want to focus on indigenous communities and how also there is a very important role of inclusive science communication. So we talked about language being a barrier, but also a tool, because the more we try to understand the language and the languages, because also indigenous communities is indigenous community have a very diverse culture, but also they make use of several languages, and the use of their language is very much tied and associated with their well-being. Some even consider language as their medicine, and we are seeing in indigenous communities an extinction of a lot of native languages to these groups, which in turn can also lead to a decline and a negative impact on their well-being. And so when I talk about a language barrier, the best way I like to visualize it is looking at a vertical language barrier and a horizontal language barrier, where the vertical language barrier representing the differences in languages used between experts and the public, and the horizontal language barrier is the different languages across different cultures. Different cultures make use of different languages to describe the way they feel, their values, their worldviews, their ways of understanding that is really unique, not only to that culture, but also to specific communities within that culture. And this is often neglected in science communication. And so, as I was saying earlier, is that the state of a community's language is closely tied to its members' mental health and overall sense of well-being. Because I want to get to the second pillar, I'm going to just rush a little bit through this, just to make the point to say that especially when we are also discussing the ethical implications of certain scientific breakthroughs in neuroscience and neurotechnology, and creating regulatory frameworks in accordance with these technologies and these applications, we need to take into account and ensure that we are taking context and culture into mind in a responsible, respectful, and inclusive way, not only to safeguard the human rights and the fundamental freedoms of certain groups, but also for the neurocognitive and cultural diversity of these groups. So we really typically discuss responsible communication in neuroscience and neurotechnology. How are we translating neuroscience findings and innovation to the wider public? But also when it comes to neuroethics, there's also a responsibility there in ensuring that we are not spreading fear or exaggerating the speculative risks that are associated with neuroscience and neurotechnology. Certain neuroethics experts argue that the field has been consumed with thinking only of science fiction scenarios, and that we need to think more of real world problems, how patients are currently struggling in dealing with, for example, explorative neurotechnologies like brain implants, and what are their certain regulations, and how should we govern or how should we implement certain research ethics plans, post-trial plans, in order to ensure that patients are being protected while participating in such explorative research. And so the point is that when we are practicing responsible neuroethics communication, it is not really only to focus on neuroscience and neurotechnology communication, but also on how we are describing ethical implications and societal implications in a way that is not creating this neuro-alarmism and also hype around the ethical concerns. The second pillar, which is more brief, relates to neuroethics communication, and that is, how are we making neuroethics accessible? This is something that I also saw accidentally, that was published, if I'm not mistaken, also scholars from Johns Hopkins, about why the world needs bioethics communication. Similar to neuroscience, ethical concerns, ethical concepts are quite abstract and complex issues that we need to find the right words and the right ways to communicate it to the public. And so here they also put forward the idea of bioethics communication to explain to the public about what are the ethical implications and how can we understand the ethical implications about certain scientific advancements. One example relates to, for example, for the COVID pandemic. There were a lot of conspiracy theories that really resulted in a lack of understanding of why certain measures were put into place in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this really created a lot of polarization and divide, where certain individuals were very pro-science and were following the regulations because they believed that this was in their best interest and in the interest of those that were most vulnerable, whereas others did not believe that any of the measures were really necessary. And here we could raise the question as to whether we could have done better at communicating not only the science behind the pandemic or the spread of the virus itself, but also about why certain measures were put into place, instead of just having this top-down approach, as we've often seen in similar situations. And also here in the communication or making neuroethics accessible, the focus is more on the vertical language barrier. There are also neuroethics experts that need to make their information and their findings and their ethical analysis easily accessible to a public, without the use of jargon, without the use of philosophical terms that might not be accessible to a wider public. And why is this important? Why should the public know about neuroethics debates and neuroethics discussions. For example, when it comes to who is controlling neural data or data that is extracted from neurotechnologies, by informing the consumers, we are ensuring that they are making informed decisions. When we explain or communicate with the public about whether cognitive enhancement interventions are fair to everyone, we are also creating responsible or facilitating being responsible consumers. And if we want to also engage in questions and discussions that relate to how can we prevent brain reading technologies from being misused, we are also inviting individuals and citizens to engage in neuroethical discussions and neuroethics debates. And we are seeing this momentum where we are starting to see neuroethics, but also neuroscience engaging with the public. There's a lot of an emergence of citizen science, where also individuals from the community, from certain communities, kind of take a lead in organizing certain studies and organizing certain efforts in order to participate in scientific and ethical discussions. And so with neuroethics today, which is, I would say, my way of communicating and raising awareness about neuroethics, and not necessarily only about the neuroscience itself, but really about the ethical implications. And I invite you all to also take a look and reach out if you are interested. But I find it very important to ensure that all the discussions that are taking place in the scientific literature, in the ethics literature, to also be accessible to a wider public, and sometimes even to other experts, non-ethics experts. I come from a field of neuroscience where, unfortunately, the term ethics was either associated with animal research ethics, which was in and of itself seen in a very negative way because of the administrative burden that is associated with animal research, whereas, and on the other hand, there's also with certain individuals, with certain professors, there was this also negative perception and negative attitude towards the incorporation of ethics, for example, in neuroscientific research, because there wasn't really an acknowledgement of the value that ethics brings. Because historically, a lot of scientists have seen ethics as a hindering science and kind of creating roadblocks for the advancement and the rapid advancements of science. And with neuroethics today, I try to make use of different mediums and different ways to really engage with different groups and different individuals, including neuroscientists, including the public, by making use of social media, for example, like Instagram, and also making use of those more catchy and interactive ways to interact with probably also younger groups. And also more recently, which this is something that has also been mainly led by our public affinity group at the International Neuroethics Society, where we've started a neuroethics magazine in order to also, in a very concise way, share some snippets of neuroethics issues, neuroethics discussions in a way that makes it very accessible to a wider public. So, to end, I think it is very important to start thinking about redefining the role of science and ethics communicators. Science communicators are not only there to translate the science. They are really important actors in creating bridges between different actors, between different experts, between society and science, but also in shaping public trust. And I hope I was able to showcase the importance of neuroethics communication in promoting neuroethics literacy, preventing misinformation, guiding ethical decision-making and policy, but also fostering trust in science and in ethics. So I want to leave the last 8 minutes for any questions or feedback or remarks. And also, I want to invite you to think with me about a question that has been very, I think, very timely. And because of current political events and because of current events that are happening across the globe, not only in the US, I've been wondering as to whether neuroethics as a field should be political. And if you're interested, I'll be diving into or attempting to answer this question in my next newsletter. So yeah, I will end there, and I hope you have some questions for me that we can probably engage further in discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. If we were in person, of course, you would be hearing applause at this moment, but Zoom has evolved dramatically over the last 5 years, but it has not effectively solved this one particular problem. So maybe while people are thinking of their questions and dropping them in the chat, maybe I will start with one, which is about neuroethics today and the audiences you have been able to reach, right? Like I know part of that story because of the relationship, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about, who you've been able to reach, what topics have sort of been the most generative, like what have people really been interested in, and if you've learned anything from that.
Yeah, I think in particular, I would say I have been able to reach a diverse audience, diverse groups. I think for a while my main focus was on neurosciences because this was also a bit my motivation to start neuroethics today. I came from a neuroscience background. I was surrounded by neuroscientists, and I had a lot of those ethical questions that were emerging. And I couldn't find the answers, or I couldn't even engage in discussion with fellow neuroscientists. And it kind of a bit surprised me because I saw that this was important for me as a neuroscientist to also be aware of the implications of my work and of the work of the field. And so I would say my main audience for a long time was really neuroscientists. And then at some point, I was able to engage with, I would say, non-experts, so more the wider public, especially through the work that I did on social media, including Instagram. There, I also saw that there was, for a very long time, a lot of interaction, a lot of engagement, and it was definitely on issues that related to cutting edge neurotechnologies, whether it was brain-computer interfaces, artificial intelligence, neural organoids. So these hot topics that we typically see portrayed in the media in a certain way, this was definitely something that was gaining a lot of attention. And I think what I try to do is just kind of break the hype, but still showcase that, yes, these are interesting, these are important, and there are ethical discussions, but we just need to do that in a more nuanced way.
Thank you. So we do have a question in the chat. I'll read it for everyone. I have been grappling with how bioethics as a field seems to fear political considerations in a direct way. What do you think needs to happen for the field of ethics to move away from the more regressive notion that engaging with principles of social justice compromises the, quote, objectivity of the work? So this goes to your last question, to your invitation to think with you about the role of the political in a field like bioethics or neuroethics.
Yeah, I don't want to give away my answer to the newsletter. But this is definitely a question that I am struggling with because um, so I can say that I came new into the field of bioethics. I have a longer training in neuroscience that I do in bioethics or in neuroethics. And this was definitely one thing that I questioned a lot, is that how come we engage so much in raising concerns about social justice when it comes to science, when it comes to so scientific applications, when it comes to neurotechnologies, but when it comes um, to political issues, we tend to, or at least from what I've seen, and that's of course my personal opinion, is we tend to pick and choose what do we want to stand up for. We tend to pick and choose what is safe to discuss. And I think there are two answers to this, or two things that we need to think about. Is first, have we maybe not created safe spaces to discuss certain political issues in a way that allows all of us, bioethicists or non-bioethicists, all academics, to engage in certain conversations um, in a free way, in an open way, in a constructive way, instead of being labeled, or instead of being canceled, or instead of being, I think I have been thinking about whether maybe there is a certain fear in speaking up. So maybe the space that we've created has not been really adequate for that. And the second is, maybe I will kind of hint to that, is that maybe we should be, maybe we have also a sort of a moral obligation to not only discuss social justice in certain aspects, but maybe discuss it as a general theme that reflects all aspects of our lives and at different layers in our society.
Thank you. That actually takes us right to the top of the hour. So perfectly timed response. And I think an invitation to tune in to your newsletter. Um, so I would just like to thank you again for joining us today, and for sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you so much.